All right, welcome back. In our last video, we added some enemies that are now kind of patrolling our platforms. We also added these bumpers, these static bodies that have no picture on them, to kind of be this hidden bumper that allows the enemy to move back and forth and contains them within a certain area. The problem is it also contains our player. And to see this and to see it a little more interestingly, we can also have a look at under the debug menu. You can see a visible collision shape. This is really handy for when you're trying to kind of figure out what's going on with your game and if there's some problems. Because right now it's hitting, my player's hitting it. And if I show visible collision shapes during my game, if I play this, you'll see that the shapes are visible. So it kind of helps in the debugging process. Because I can see all of the collision shapes, and it's really handy to figure out. And I noticed that we're missing this one, which I knew about in my tile map, but it also shows you why I can't move there. I'm hitting the solid wall, and the enemy is as well. So what I need to be able to do is to not have the player hit this wall and to have the enemy hit this wall, which may seem strange, but there's some really great features in Godot that allow us to do this. Um, and it can get a little bit complicated, but let's try and have a look at how we can make this work. And it's really powerful because you can now have an object there that another object doesn't interact with, but one that the enemy does. So what we want to add here, and if we've got my player, let's bring my player up and make it the easiest one here. Um, on a setting here, we can see under collision that we've got a lot of options that we haven't played with here. So we have something called collision layers and collision masks, and there's 32 of each, which is a crazy number you're never going to need to use. But essentially what happens is we can put each thing, each object, and let's get rid of this here. Each object can kind of be in a separate layer of the game. If I'm say here's my eyeball here looking down. That is a terrible eye, but there we go, some eyelashes there. Looking down, you can think of a layer like being a sheet of glass that objects can live on. And at the moment, they're all in one layer. So I've got my player there, I've got a wall here, there's the enemy, and if we go along, they will bump into each other and interact with each other. But in a collision layer system, we can have different layers here. I've got everything from layer 1, 2, 3, and essentially up to 32 different ones. We can put things in different layers, and this allows us to, say, have the enemy and maybe that bumper in one particular layer, but the player, I'm going to put a hat on the player just to make it different. The player could live in a different layer so that as they're moving along, the player doesn't interact with the bumper, but in this case, it doesn't interact with the enemy as well. But we can also create what are called masks. And a mask is essentially which other layers one object can interact with. So I could say, if I go back in time here now, let's put the enemy in layer 1. Let's put the player in layer 1. I'm going to put the bumper in layer 2. And I'm going to put the enemy in layer 3. And what I can do is, using masks, I can say I want the player to interact with anything that's in layer 1, but also to interact with things that are in layer 3, but not interact with anything that's in layer 2. So the player can come along and bump into the enemy. And then I can also say, well, the enemy is in layer 3, but I want it to interact with things that are in layer 2, maybe in layer 3 as well, and maybe 7 other layers if I want. So it will interact with all of those things, but not other things. So for instance, maybe you didn't want the enemies to be able to bump into each other. You wanted them to be able to pass through each other. I could say, well, I don't want it to interact with other things that are in layer 3. I just want it to interact with things that are in layer 2 and in things within layer 1 because I want the enemy to be able to hit the player. So with some combination of these layers and masks, we can kind of control what things are allowed to hit other things. Now, this can get really confusing when you start to have all of these numbered layers because you're like, oh, which layer was the bumper in, which layer was the enemy in, and when you've got prizes and coins and goals and doors and all sorts of other things, that can get a little confusing. So we fortunately have the ability under project settings to go down here, and we have the physics layers, and I'm going to click on my physics 2D, oh sorry, down here, layer names, 2D physics. And right now you can see all of these layers are popping up here. So what I want to do is instead of just having numbers, I can actually talk about what I'm going to put into those layers. So I'm going to say that the world is in layer 1. I'm going to use all lowercase here. So that will be my tile set and everything I want to have as part of my general background. We can make the player layer 2, and I can also have a bumper layer, and I can also have an enemy layer, and I can have as many different layers as I want to have, like, oh, let's say collectibles. Later on, I start thinking, but I also have the goal that's there, and that would be a kind of thing that I want the player to be able to get, but the enemies aren't really going to interact with or touch. So you have up to 32 layers here you can keep, but these are basically most of my things at the moment, so I'm going to leave that there. And now you can see that as I hover over top of them, we've got these layers are all interacting with other things. All these layers are named, sorry. You can see there's the player, there's the bumper, there's the thing, and mask level layer number 1 is now called world. So it makes my life a little easier because what I can do is say, well, I want the player is going to live in the player layer. And it's going to interact with the world. It needs to hit the ground. It doesn't need to interact with itself because there's no other player things. It doesn't need to interact with the bumpers, but it does need to interact with the enemy. And there's a whole bunch of other ones if I want here. So by putting this in its own layer, now I get to control what things it connects and interacts with. And I'm going to save that. And I need to change a few other things in the scenes. So the bumper, I'm going to click on the bumper there and say, go over to its collision layer and say, well, the bumper is not in the world. I want the bumper to be in the bumper layer. It lives with the bumper and it can interact with the world, sure. It's not going to interact with the player, and it is going to interact with the enemy. Now, you don't necessarily need to mask everything because you can think of it like, well, the bumpers don't really do the interacting. In fact, I'm going to just take that off there. The enemy is going to interact with the bumper. The bumper doesn't need to interact with the enemy, but you can make it go both ways if you wish. So let's switch over now to the enemy and do the same idea here. I'm going to make the enemy live in the enemy layer. That was level 4. And it's going to interact with the world. It needs to hit the ground and other walls, but it needs to interact with the player. And it also needs to interact with the bumper. So it's going to hit those 3 things. And as I said, this can get a little bit confusing as we get lots and lots of layers, but just trying to think what layer does it live in and what thing is it going to interact with? That's the difference between the layer and mask. And in general, I would recommend that you have one thing live in one layer and it can mask to multiple different things. Although if you get really complicated, you can certainly have it living in different layers and masking to different things, but that can get a little bit more complicated. So let's try and keep it simple. Now, however, if I switch back to my level, we can see if my setup worked here. So notice the player jumps on the ground. It's great. I've left this collision mask on so I can see it. I can see that the enemy is interacting with the bumpers. So I said that's what I wanted to do. Oh, something weird happened up there. Figure out what happened there. But I can also see now that my player passes right through this. It does interact with the enemy, so I can, you know, if I wanted to, I could ride on its head there. But these bumpers have no effect on me, and so I can walk right through them. I'm not sure what happened. Oh, I think the enemy might have fallen through there because maybe we didn't make the enemy interact with the world. Oh, or there's just a big empty gap there, and it hit the edge for some reason, which is a little bit strange. But what I might want to make sure is so that I can clean up those tiles. Go into my tile set, go into the paint, and go down to physics, and I can see that this one has not been completed properly. So I'm going to just add that and then add a couple more. There we go. And then apply it there. So I should be able to see that my floors are now set up properly, and hopefully that guy doesn't walk through it anymore. Oh, we're getting a very interesting thing happening with that enemy. Just gonna move that bumper down a little bit. You can get some odd things happening with collisions if you don't have them set quite properly. Let's watch that enemy. There he goes. Running around. It was just kind of off a little bit and it wasn't hitting it properly. There you go. So now we have the ability to pass through, and it doesn't look quite as magical when we have the collision shapes on, but if I turn those off in my debug mode, for when I'm actually playing the game, now we have some working, and it was great to set them up there, bumpers that I can't see. They do affect my enemy, however, they're not affecting my player, and now I've got oh, I think what I've done is made a mistake on that tile there. It's getting stuck on the tile. So I would go through and maybe make sure that the collision shape, it might be bumping up a little bit there so that when I hit it, coming in a particular direction, yeah, I'm hitting the edge there. So I would go through and fix that tile shape, that tile map shape. But now you've got a great little game that you can play. You've got some bumpers here. Your enemy passes through them, no problem. And sorry, your player passes through them, no problem, but the enemy gets turned around, and we've started to create, you know, some timing here. Now, at the moment, my enemies don't do anything to me. I can ride on their heads. So let's fix that in our next video and make it a quick one.